So what do we think of when we think of David? Do we think of heroic faith and courage? His magnificent songs represented by the Psalms? Or maybe we think of Psalm 51, where we have wonderful comfort for the believer who falls into sin. We're told, though, about his character as a whole, that he was a man after God's own heart. But in David we also see the bitter fruit from the root of his forefather Jacob.
Yes. David was capable of deceit and manipulation to the point where he used those to murder a man so that he could get his wife. We also see him being very vindictive when he's slighted by Nabal. And it's only the intervention of Nabal's wife that stops him from not only killing Nabal, but he's planning on killing the whole village or home, all the people. So we also see in David similarities when it comes to his dysfunction, when it comes to his sex life, in that he ends up with many wives, more than Jacob. So he doesn't learn from Jacob. He takes on dozens of wives. And
well, at least a dozen.
Yeah, and has a very messy family because of it.
Yeah. So what's the fruit of all of this in David's family? Well, one of his children rapes his half-sister. Another hates that crime so much that he ends up killing his brother. And then this same son, Absalom, tries to steal the kingdom away from his father. And yet another, of course, becomes King Solomon, and has at least the beginning of his reign the characteristics, the good characteristics of David, but later on other characteristics of David pop out as well. So we think primarily when we think of David as the heroic character of the first half of his life. But most of 2 Samuel, where we have the later story of David and his family life, is about his children and his history with his children, where the bitter root of Jacob becomes bitter fruit. David's old age, particularly, is not very happy. Even on his deathbed, 2 of his sons are fighting to see who will be his heir. Splits up the supporters of David into 2 camps. Supporters of Adonijah, supporters of Solomon.
Then with Solomon, you end up having his following in his father's footsteps and having hundreds of wives, and these wives also being from different surrounding nations, so they would also have different gods. So you can just imagine what that does to the raising of children. What are his children possibly going to be like when he has shown that he's putting his faith in these insurance policies with different women?
It's called wise foreign policy in political circles, right? But this is promiscuity hiding behind practical wisdom
and lack of faith in God.
Yeah. We could say then that the civil war that breaks out shortly after Solomon dies is ultimately the fault of this family catastrophe. The family of Israel is now broken completely because the royal family sets such a poor example. So Solomon later, for all the glory of the temple, which is one of the wonders of the world apparently, he has to place a heavy burden on his own people to bring that temple about. This heavy temple tax, finally, when the prophecy of the civil war is brought to Solomon's son Rehoboam, we find out that it will be represented by the tearing of the fabric of Israel, which pictured by the tearing of the royal robe, as it were, into 12 pieces. And that from then on, war will be the character of Israel's political life. War between the 2 factions who would fight a civil war for 300 plus years until the exile. So when you see the whole period, when you look at that whole period from David down to the exile, you think of maybe that text in Romans where Paul says we see both the kindness and the severity of God, his grace in letting this thing work out to its ultimate conclusion, but also the exile as a severe judgment that when we look back at that becomes the only way apparently that God could cure their continuous defection, their continuous backsliding.
Yeah. We wanted to read Malachi 3:6, right? As an illustration of God's character. For I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore you, O children of Jacob, are not consumed.
So this is 100 years after the exile. He's saying the only reason you're here is because I don't change.
Yeah.
Your deflections and your compromises have not changed my intention toward you. So this is now not only 1,000 years after Moses that God has been faithful, but going back all the way to Jacob, 1,400 years of continued unfaithfulness and compromise coming down to this. And so...
Yeah, and I thought the text emphasizes children of Jacob.
Yeah, again.
So instead of calling him Israel, he calls him Jacob here.
Yeah.
So this underlines God's being a God of grace.
Yeah.
Not Jacob being a nice guy or good character.
No, you might think of the words of James. In the New Testament, James says, mercy triumphs over judgment. But the whole Old Testament tells the tale a different slant on it, which is that God will not spare us the fruit of the seeds we plant. So when you get to the New Testament, you think of a text like Galatians 6 verse 7, where we're told that although grace wins finally, we reap what we sow. Maybe we should read that.
Galatians 6:7, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that he will also reap.
So we're told we reap what we sow. That doesn't necessarily mean that we reap in the quantity that we sow. So we might see injustice, and men will cry out injustice when they see that sometimes small compromises lead to gigantic results, and that doesn't seem to us to be just, but God has prepared us for that eventuality too. In the Old Testament, in Hosea chapter 8 verse 7, he says, you have sown the wind, you reap the whirlwind. So that's the funny thing about sin that we forget, namely that sin is lawlessness, we're told. So we can't expect from sin any rule. So if we let sin out of the box, the size of the monster we have created is often, to us at least, far larger than the seed we sowed. So sin, like the sinner, obeys no law. Surely that's the chief lesson from of course, the story of the original sin in the Garden of Eden, that from a piece of fruit, looked at one way, comes all this evil. Suffering is seldom proportionate to sin, therefore we're saying. Let's not bring God's judgment, therefore, upon our children by the least compromise if we can avoid it. God's mercy and judgment will both be displayed in our children as well as our own lives. Never let sin out of its dark confines in our heart, because it's like a pestilence or a fire. Sin will spread beyond our control and beyond our lifetime. Just as the blessings of grace far exceed just deserts, so may the curses that follow upon our tiniest compromises. Grace transcends law or justice, but sin ignores law and justice.
But we shouldn't forget that Jesus also said that if one is faithful in what is least, he will be faithful in much. So at the same time, even the little things that we do that are faithful, I think they build up our strength, so that when a bigger thing happens, we have the strength to do the right thing. So those also reap. You reap from those little consistent obediences. It's
true. It's a frightening truth. The God with whom nothing is impossible has so constructed the universe that there is one thing impossible for even God. Even the God of the impossible cannot undo the past. In case we think we're risking blasphemy here, we better say God will not undo the past. In so doing, he's created our universe just as he has saved us by an act of infinite condescension. What is his gift to each one of us? We all make an irreversible creative contribution to the cosmos, as it were. What we've done, are doing, and will do. All these deeds and words for which we are responsible, all those things we do and fail to do. are causing, as it were, infinite ripples in the eternal sea. Put that another way, as Jesus does, every careless word that men speak, they shall give an account for it on the day of judgment. So what infinite grace God has towards us, that he should give us such power over the future of the worlds. What awesome privilege and responsibility we inherit to change the future of all those lives we touch.
Yes.
Amen.
Amen.